French President Emmanuel Macron traveled to Washington, where he held a joint press conference this afternoon with President Biden.
The United States is helping Europe diversify
other topics. Prior to Macron's state visit, he criticized President Biden's unfortunately named Inflation Reduction Act. Of its protectionist climate policies, the French president said the act will, quote, perhaps fix your issue, but will increase my problem. But today, President Biden suggested he's helping the energy problems in Europe. Let's play clip one.
The United States is helping Europe diversify away from Russian natural gas in the immediate term, and while accelerating our clean energy transitions, and we're going to continue working in close partnership with Europe as we move forward.
President Biden was also asked about the railway workers' strike and the legislative attempts to avoid it.
Do the freight rail workers deserve more than 1 day of paid sick leave, like millions of Americans have? And if so, why didn't you negotiate for that when you were helping to negotiate that contract that you now want Congress to impose?
I love you guys. I negotiated a contract no one else could negotiate. The only thing that was left out was whether or not it was paid leave.
Joining me now to discuss all of it is U.S. Representative Kevin Hern. He serves on the House Ways and Means Committee. He is the newly elected chairman of the Republican Study Committee. He represents Oklahoma's 1st District. Congressman Hern, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Joseph, great to be with you.
Well, I want to get with all of that, but before I do, there is some breaking news this afternoon that the Supreme Court will maintain the hold on President Biden's student loan bailout program, and he'll hear oral arguments on that case in February. What's your reaction?
Well, it's kind of interesting that President Biden has to be told now 3 times no, starting with, if for all the listeners, go all the way back to July 28, 2021, when the most senior legislator in Congress, Nancy Pelosi, said that it was unconstitutional for Joe Biden to forgive student loans. He did not have the constitutional authority to do so. He's now been told by a Texas federal judge and by an appellate court that he can't do it. So it's going to go to the Supreme Court, and once for all, we'll get a ruling that it's unconstitutional, because he wants to be a complete dictator in a sense that he has the full authority to not only execute the laws, but also go out and appropriate money and spend money and completely bypass the Congress. So it's going to be really interesting. But, you know, some of the sort of the flippant questions you might ask a president like this is, how far back is he going to forgive loans for all those who have paid for their debts, who made the decision to go to college, took out student loans, paid their debts back? Or is this only for, as he's described, for people that are currently looking for him to buy votes for? And this is what's really frustrating. It keeps moving. As you may remember, he couldn't even identify how much it was going to cost because he didn't care. He was just going to forgive debt, and all Americans would pay for it. We would borrow money from China and continue this insatiable appetite to spend. You mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, that he is causing great energy problems for Europe and for our own country, for that matter. Even in that alone, you know, he talked about reducing the deficit, but everything he's done since then is increase the deficit with things like these gimmicks of giving away or forgiving student loans, rather.
Well, it seems probable that the Supreme Court will agree with the lower courts and decide that this is not constitutional. But arguably, the benefit to President Biden has already been achieved, because this was announced prior to the election, and any kind of bump he got in voter enthusiasm and voter turnout has already been realized. So the rest of this ultimately may not matter for the administration. But I want to move on to the press conference that President Biden today had with President Macron. Did you learn anything?
Well, I didn't see the press conference. I was actually on the floor voting, but I can tell you this is what this president continues to think he's doing by just completely going after and destroying our fossil fuel industry and pretending that somehow the wind energy and solar energy is going to replace the output of our natural fuels, our fossil fuels. And we've seen it time and time again, from the day he got sworn in, to killing the Keystone XL pipeline, to, saying he doesn't like pipelines in the United States, but going and blessing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. What he's done now and going and begging Iran and Saudi Arabia, and now just this week, Venezuela, and turning Chevron loose to start drilling there, as opposed to drilling more here in our own country where high-paying jobs can be created. This president knows that he is completely owned by the Socialist Democrat arm of his party, and that he is not going to do the right thing, which is to quit begging the radical nations around the world for energy when we have that amount of fuel we need right here in this country, that we can help places like France and, and make sure they don't have to depend on terrorist nation and human rights abusers around the world.
And we're speaking with Congressman Kevin Hern from Oklahoma. And Congressman, prior to President Macron's visit, he had criticized President Biden's energy policy. What are his concerns from the perspective of from a European ally?
Well, when you look at what happened when Ukraine was invaded by Russia, there's no coincidence that Russia invaded Ukraine during the winter months and put, just a sampling of pressure on Eastern Europe and certainly an entire European nation on what it was going to be like when oil and gas stopped flowing from Russia. And you look at what's happening now as we move into the winter again, and we have the ability to supply all the LNG that Europe would need. And yet they're forcing France and other European nations to look across the world to make up these lacks of supply they have that's been coming from Russia for all these years. And because they can't get it from the United States, and what do we argue? That we're going to send them somehow more solar energy and more wind energy, which will not make up for the reduction of this. I mean, when you look at what's happening with energy costs in Europe, they're 500-600% higher than they were a year ago. And that's all because of what's going on in Ukraine and because of the energy policy that this administration, the Biden administration, has implemented since he's been in office.
There's controversy over our energy policy south of the border as well in South America. The White House has recently eased restrictions on oil purchases from Venezuela. Why is that controversial?
Well, again, when you look at what's happening with Chevron, the not letting them drill here, and then their comments are as well, because you have 9,000 permits that have been offered, but they haven't done anything that has allowed them to drill here. Well, what they're not telling the whole story is that the restrictions, the regulations associated with that makes it improbable that anybody would want to go invest literally millions and millions of dollars to stand up new wells or drill new wells and put new rigs in the ground when you have an administration that has time and time again said openly that they want to destroy the industry. So again, you've got Venezuela, who not too long ago opened up their jails and turned people loose to invade our southern border. And what the reward they get for doing this is that the Biden administration goes to Maduro, basically recognizes him as the leader, a radical leader of a nation that has crumbled, and all for the purpose of giving them the opportunity to create the jobs and send the energy to the United States. And when, again, we could create that energy and put it here in our own country and not have to depend on a nation like Venezuela.
The way you describe it there seems so simple that it would be better to drill our own oil at home rather than fund a totalitarian regime there, Maduro in Venezuela. It's doing terrible things to its people. Why does the White House not see it that way? What's their perspective?
Well, unfortunately, I think everyday Americans can see this, and that's what's frustrating. Some of the easier decisions in foreign policy and national security, like energy security and border security, at our southern border, these are things that every American should want. It shouldn't be a partisan issue. It should be a bipartisan issue. It should be an American issue that we want to secure our nation through great policies, like, again, our southern border policy and our energy policy that we had both under control less than 24 months ago. And here we are now with a president who has talked a great game, but has never sent anyone to the southern border to fix it. When you look at the Department of Homeland Security, and this is all together on the whole issues we're having on our national security issue. I mean, you got Mayorkas, who said the border is fine. When you look at our energy policy, the president has taken the lead on this to say that our energy policy is not important in the United States. We're going to somehow convert everybody to green cars. But they have a policy in place that says you can't get the credit for electric vehicles. It's just convoluted. That's what's so frustrating about the processes this administration and these Democrats have put forward. And I think the American people have seen this. And that's why right now the Republicans have been put back in the majority of the House, and we have an opportunity to lead on these issues as we go into January.
And speaking of your opportunities to lead going into January, you have been elected as the new leader of the Republican Study Committee. Congratulations on that. For those who may not be familiar, what role does the Republican Study Committee play in Congress, and what do you hope to do in that role?
Yeah, so it's been around for, it'll be 50 years in April, and it's really been the conservative conscience of the conference, working on alongside and in parallel with the entire conference, the entire Republican conference of 222 members. There's about 170 Republicans that are on this committee, the Republican Study Committee. It's an honor to be the chair. It's a 2-year term, but it's really about looking at policies, must-pass bills, and getting the most conservative solutions put forth for being able to be voted on. One of the things I'm most proud of is working on a budget that actually balances both last year and this year. Republican Study Committee historically has put forth a budget that's been voted on the floor when the Republicans have been in control. I anticipate it will be so as well in the spring. But it really does what every American that has to be done in the cities, the counties, the communities across America, the states have to balance their budgets. And this puts forth a way forward for us to be better fiduciary, responsible legislators with the American taxpayer dollars. And that's what this does. It'll be something, it'll be a real honor to see hit the floor and see where the American legislators here in Washington, D.C. stand on protecting American taxpayer dollars.
Congressman Hern, very quickly, the so-called Respect for Marriage Act goes from the Senate to the House. 47 Republicans voted to support it last time. What do you expect this time in about 15 seconds?
Probably about the same, I would guess. It's unfortunate. I will do everything to stand for religious liberties and religious freedoms. And that's what the real problem right now is. We're just getting attacked on all fronts. And I know it's something that Tony has pushed his entire career working on. So I look forward to continuing to fight that fight.
And we will continue to stand with you and pray for you. Congressman Kevin Hern, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.